What is up, guys? Today you're about to learn the highest win rate opening for white after the first move pawn to e4. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov and I'm talking about this position, the most common chess opening of all. And at this point, you can ditch the old and spoiled fried liver and instead serve your opponent something fresh and extra spicy, the Deutz Gambit. It is indeed the highest win rate opening for white compared to all traditional alternatives, and for a good reason. It is extra aggressive, you take your opponent out of his home prep, and it is objectively sound. You're not risking much. So here, computer recommends to capture the pawn by the bishop. We'll talk about that in a second, but let's start with pawn takes, which is something that most of your opponents will do, which is already kinda wrong, because it allows you to push this pawn forward and attack his knight. Strangely enough, there is no convenient square for the knight to go to. For example, if your opponent tries to bring it to the center, which is a classical recommendation, bring your pieces to the center of the board, in this case, he just adds one more story to his upcoming memoir, 50 Shades of Blunders. After you attack the knight has no squares to go to. It is captured. Your pawn takes away these two squares, while your minor pieces, your knight and bishop, control that square on g5. Therefore, the knight has nowhere to go. It is trapped. And if your opponent tries to support it somehow, it doesn't work, because if you know that magical move, an en passant capture, then you take out that pawn and he's left with all the same problem. Moreover, now the knight is also pinned down to the king. Therefore, he's going to definitely lose this knight. You can also add one more attacker if you need to, and black is gone. Some of your opponents will move the knight right here, also moving forward and potentially attacking your central pawn on e5. It's also a wrong move for black. There are different ways for you to handle this. I like this move. It's objectively not the strongest, but it is the most aggressive. You get to the king right away. You temporarily sacrifice the bishop, but on the next turn you continue with this check, which puts his king in check and also his ego in check. Now the king has to move, but after that you take away that minor piece on g4, and which means that with this little combo, with this temporary sacrifice of a piece, now you totally expose his king. And although the position, objectively speaking, remains to be about equal, but for a human person, it's very hard to play with such an exposed and weak king. He cannot castle anymore, this rook is locked, and overall black cannot normally continue his development. Moreover, they'll usually capture this pawn attacking your queen, which looks good for a second, but in reality it's just yet another mistake by black. Now after a queen goes here, it attacks the knight, but the main problem for black is, as he defends the knight, your queen comes forward, and now you get to the king. And that is the end. The king has only one square to go to, which is here, and now you'd wish to deliver this checkmate, but you can't do that right away because his knight controls that square. Therefore, you simply kick the knight out, and as the knight moves, you will then deliver this checkmate. Your opponent will figure it out that the knight cannot move. He'll try to play c6, attacking your queen, and asking your queen to go out, hoping that after that he'll be able to safely move the knight away. But now, you're not just taking knight. That is the favorite moment of Igor Nation. You're taking souls. You're gonna take this knight. Your opponent will get excited for a second because he'll think that you blundered the queen. He will go ahead and try to capture it, but some annoying sound will pop up and he'll realize that, oops, actually, you didn't just capture a knight. You also opened up this discovered check, which means that he has to move the king. But even there, it's not safe because it's checkmate in one. What else can your opponent play? Sometimes they'll move the knight backwards. In this case, his plan might be to follow up with these kind of moves and try it out next time. We don't know for sure. Anyway, you continue with knight to g5 hitting this pawn, and as they defend it, you then play rook e1. A very interesting move which sort of puts black in a total Zugzwang position where there's just nothing he can do. You defend this pawn, but also your rook is in an ambush. Your pawn can never push the d pawn forward, because if he moves it one or two squares forward, you can always capture with this discovered check, meaning black cannot do that. And otherwise, he'll probably settle for castling, which is a losing move, but the follow-up variation is not obvious at all. You continue with this queen attack, threatening checkmate on the next turn. Your opponent's get a cover, then you slide over to the king side, this time hitting his knight. The knight cannot move because it also has to guard that pawn. If the knight moves, your queen is going to come forward and capture the pawn with the checkmate. Therefore, he has to guard the knight by going king to g7. And it looks like black is finally safe. He castled, he's more or less under control, but that is exactly the moment when you sacrifice the queen. King has to take, and then you follow up with knight takes f7, and that is once again that same moment. When you don't take a pawn, you take souls. Because here, it's not just a double attack. In this case, your opponent would be able to simply capture it with a rook and end up with an extra queen. But besides this double attack, you also have this sudden discovered check from your bishop. Another unpleasant surprise for your opponent, which means that the king has to move, and after that, you still don't take the queen. You could, but there is an even stronger intermediate move, bishop h6. While your knight is still here, guarding this square, you're tossing this in-between move, putting your bishop into the attack. The sad reality for black is that the king has only one square to go. It is that g8 square, because your knight takes away that one. But after the king goes here, you finally take the queen. And your opponent has to face one more unpleasant surprise. He can now recapture the knight because of yet another discover check. That is crazy. The amount of discover checks in this variation is unbelievable. The king has to move, but now you can also grab the rook. And now your opponent is totally devastated. Most of your opponents will actually go ahead and take this knight, blundering this bishop. Then you'll end up with an extra rook and bishop as well. It's better for black to take the bishop instead, but it doesn't help because at the end of the day, you're up a clear rook. Moreover, you have this passed pawn, it just goes forward and you're winning the game. I really wish you would pull it off one day because you'll feel exactly like Tal. You know, like at the end of games when his opponent would resign and it would tell Tal, good game, Tal would politely smile and reply, it's been my pressure. And it usually had been. In fact, in this position, there is only one move that allows your opponent to stay in the game, but this one is hard to find. It's the move pawn to d5 with a counter strike. That way, they're opening up their bishop and they're not falling too much behind in development. Nevertheless, after that, you still keep attacking. You grab this pawn and attack the rook. The rook has to go. Now you bring a rook into play with this check. They have to cover. This time you bring the bishop into the attack with a tempo, hitting their queen. And your position is objectively better. His king is centralized. His king side is destroyed. You're putting pressure. But in most cases, they will play an inaccuracy, queen to d5, which turns the game into a total nightmare for them. We'll see why in a second. First off, you start with this fantastic move, knight to c3. You hit the queen, but of course the first question is, hey, isn't the knight under the attack? But no, because after queen takes d5, all of a sudden the bishop is pinned, and therefore he can now recapture your queen, and that means you are just up a queen, you're threatening this bishop, the king is exposed, and you're winning. He cannot do that. But instead, if the queen moves anywhere, then your knight with a tempo jumps forward to e4 with a number of threats. The main one being knight to f6 check with a fork to his king and rook, but also just in case you're putting some pressure to his bishop. And now after whatever move of black, let's say rook takes g7, which seemed to make a lot of sense for black, knight to h4 creates this absolute nightmare situation for black. Just think about this. It looks like there are quite a number of options for the queen to retreat, but what can he do really? Like the queen cannot come back because your knight controls that square as well. All right, if the queen comes forward, then you've got knight f6, fork to his king and queen, and you win it. If the queen instead comes right here to e5, then you've got this, yet another discovered attack of the queen, you win it anyway. And finally, if the queen comes here to the middle of the board, back to d5, then knight f6 is still a fork. It's all good and fun, but it's time to address the fish in the room. Computer recommends black to capture with the bishop, because after this recapture, the pawn stays on e5, therefore you cannot push your pawn forward and start that attack. Black look very solid at this point. However, this may lead to probably the most beautiful variation you'll ever play in your whole chess career. Moreover, this is so unexpected and strong that even masters and grandmasters fell for this trap. So here's the thing. Right now you're down a pawn. Okay, but it's not such a big deal. From here, the bishop pins the knight cannot go, and your next plan is probably to play f4, which will put it all on fire. Like, this pawn will be under the attack, the knight, this knight is pinning, so as soon as you push the pawn forward, black is in danger, and it feels annoying. Therefore, most of your opponents will try to kick the bishop out, but you maintain the pin, and then as soon as they try to get your bishop totally out of their territory, expecting you to retreat, this is exactly the moment when you undermine their center and self-confidence with this paradoxical move. You let them capture the bishop, because in this case, their position is going to be a total disaster. Now, their both knights are hanging, their king is exposed, and they're going to probably lose very quickly. So that is good for you. Now, how about black trying to keep the position closed, and what can they possibly do? Now, this pawn cannot easily go away because it needs to guard the knight. If they try to capture by this pawn to keep the position closed and in control, then it comes down to our favorite quote, don't judge a rook by its cover, you sacrifice the rook to get to this knight on d4, and now this poor knight on f6 is as restricted as it can possibly be. It's a crisscross pin absolute nightmare once again for black. There's nothing they can do to stop this bishop takes f6 move, which will grab a knight. Plus, from there, the bishop will actually trap the queen and will attack the rook. That is, again, totally insane. And if black thinks, okay, at least I'm going to castle, get the rook out of danger, then it also leads to an absolutely beautiful finish. You capture the knight, attacking the queen. The queen has only one square to go to. And now, actually, I'll give you 5 seconds to think about this on your own. There is a way for white to finish the game right away, within a couple moves. You may try to find the solution. It's a very unusual pattern. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in any other game. But here, like, obviously you're attacking, you're grabbing material, it's all good, but how to checkmate black? The move is bishop to h8. And black somehow cannot stop you from sort of fianchettoing your queen. Of course, in this position, your opponent can play whatever else. We cannot analyze everything. I'll show you a couple typical attacking patterns right here. So first off, if your opponent is very prudent and does not castle kingside, which actually requires your opponent to be quite advanced and to figure out that the standard move is not good in this particular case, but we'll talk about that. Anyway, your opponent should normally play d6, and then as you play your normal move pawn f4 to include a rook into the attack, then try to offer you an exchange of bishops. And here you gotta be careful. To take as a mistake, you should not so easily allow your opponent to trade off your active pieces. Instead, what you should do is to play knight a3, which develops a knight and guards your bishop. So you're kind of saying, you know what, if you want to trade, let's do it on my terms. So if you take right here on c4, I'm going to bring my knight closer to the middle of the board. I'm going to increase pressure to this pawn. Maybe I'll play c3, kick this knight out, I have this pin, my rook is active. And although objectively black is okay, if he plays super accurately, maybe he can hold. But I think realistically, it's easier to play this position with white. If your opponent plays a more traditional move, simply castles, then you do play f4, and now your opponent is in trouble. You attack this pawn on e5. He cannot take here because then his knight on d4 would lose its support and you would capture it in that case. Therefore d6 is forced, and now you just play knight c3, aiming to simply increase the pressure on this pinned knight, probably to jump forward with your knight. And your opponent may play h6, I think it's the most played move in this position, but somehow this attempt to neutralize the pin never works for black in this position because you've got another counter strike. Pawn takes e5. Now he can't take your bishop, but in this case he's going to lose the knight. And from there, you know, your pawn attacks here, his knight on d4 is now hanging, the king is totally exposed, the knight is ready to jump forward. That is total devastation of black. If instead he just recaptures right here, then your bishop does not have to go back. This time you have support from your rook and you can take on f6. And because the bishop is guarded by the rook, he cannot recapture with the queen, which is the move he would normally wish to play, but in this case, your rook does not allow this to happen, which means that he will have to recapture this way, making his king totally exposed. Now you can just go ahead and start attacking it, threatening this pawn. You can also play knight d5 in the next turn, threatening this pawn, and again, that is over for black. In most cases, they play king h7, blundering this pawn on f7, because it's also attacked by your queen, and then if he tries to kick out your bishop, then it leads to this simple but nice checkmate. So far we haven't talked about the final alternative. Black can capture this pawn with a knight, which is the worst move of all, but nevertheless you need to know how to take advantage of that. You capture this pawn on e5 while hitting the other pawn on f7 with your knight and bishop. Your opponent castles to protect the pawn, and now you play bishop e3. Basically, you've won the game. You know, while playing gambits, typically you sacrifice material, but of course it's even more efficient when you sacrifice your opponent's pieces. Bonk. Here you attack this knight in the middle of the board with your bishop and knight, but the knight cannot retreat back, because if the knight moves, that's going to drop the bishop that stands behind. So that is the problem for black. After some thinking, your opponent may retreat here, hoping to defend the bishop that way, so that if you take it, he can recapture with his knight. But you've got something better. Instead of taking the bishop right away, which is indeed just an exchange, you can first trade off the defender and then grab this bishop for nothing. If your opponent tries to avoid that, he will capture right here on e3, but you can continue this, fest of capturing everything that you can. This is a check to the king, and after a couple more captures, once the dust settles, you're up a pawn, and in exchange, you're winning the game. Even more so, you're threatening e5, you're threatening queen d5. After that, or even right away, because the knight is pinned. And if your opponent tries to stop that, then that is another super cool moment. You can double the fun with pawn to e5. And this attacks the knight. The knight is pinned by the rook, therefore the knight cannot move. But he cannot capture your pawn with that pawn, because that pawn is also pinned. So that is why it is a double pin. And you kind of show your opponent the difference. When he played that move pawn e5, that was his first move of the game. When you played, it's the last move of the game. There is another very important thing to know here. While some of your opponents will play bishop to c5, it's also very common for them to develop the knight right here. What do you do in this case? Well, it will very often transpose into the same variation. If you castle kingside, most of your opponents will still develop the bishop, which will lead to the very same position after d4 we get our Deutz Gambit. However, how about your opponent capturing this pawn on e4? That changes the situation. Not many will play that, roughly around 20%, but nevertheless you need to know what to do. Here it would be very bad for white to play something like this, because it looks good at first, but he's got a very nice move d5, which guards the knight and attacks the bishop, and it's really beneficial for black. You do not want to go there. Instead, what you want to play here is the move knight to c3. That is the move that I recommend. I think it works really well for white. Here, not only you attack the knight, but you also control the square d5. Therefore, he cannot just play d5 and defend the knight. He's got to do something else. And then you end up with a classical gambit situation when you are down a pawn, but you're far ahead in development and have really nice attacking chances here. It's kind of like the Stafford Gambit with reversed color and with an extra tempo. Now, the position, objectively speaking, is approximately equal. Black has to be extremely careful. If he plays any casual move such as this one, then after knight g5, he's gone. You get to that f7 pawn to the king, and you get a decisive attack right away. Now, spoiler, your opponent has to play that move, and then he's quite safe. He can safely castle on the next turn. Then the best thing you can do is to play queen d5 with a double attack of these two pawns. He castles, you get back your pawn, and now we end up with an approximately equal normal position, but you're absolutely fine. With that being said, lots of your opponents will play by analogy with the Italian game. We'll develop the bishop right here, which is another careless move which allows your knight to jump forward and to start a winning attack. Now he's totally overloaded. Queen takes h7 is coming. Black has to stop that, but now you capture that pawn, attacking the queen. Your bishop supports that, so is your queen. Your other bishop is ready to be sacrificed right here and to open up the king. And again, you got this winning attack. If he tries to get the queen out of danger, then you hit him with yet another discover check and a double check. The king has to move. Now one more discover check and double check, and then you finish the game. And if you dislike memorizing variations, you want to know how to understand chess and how to find those moves by yourself, I've got this free masterclass where I'm sharing how I and my students find those correct moves, even in blitz games, and you can check this out.